I brought my daughter. I hope that's okay, she said nervously on a blind date. Then the single dad did something unthinkable. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Paige Donnelly was sitting in her car outside the Harvest Table restaurant in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on a Friday evening in early November, trying to convince herself this wasn't the worst idea she'd ever had. And her 7-year-old daughter Chloe was in the back seat asking for the third time why they were just sitting there instead of going inside. The problem was Paige's mom had called 2 hours ago with a stomach bug and couldn't babysit. And Paige had spent the last hour and 45 minutes debating whether to cancel this blind date her best friend Monica had set up, or just show up with a child in tow and hope the guy didn't immediately run for the exits. She typed out 3 different cancellation texts and deleted each one because Monica had been relentless about this setup for weeks, swearing up and down that Troy was perfect for her, and Paige had finally agreed mostly to get Monica off her back about her non-existent dating life. Paige worked as a medical billing specialist, which meant she spent 40 hours a week staring at insurance codes and fighting with healthcare providers over claims. And between that job and being a single mom to Chloe, she barely had time to shower some days, let alone date. Chloe's dad had bailed when she was 2, moved to Colorado with his new girlfriend, and sent child support checks that were consistently 3 weeks late. And Paige had been doing the single-parent thing solo for 5 years with help from her mom, and exactly zero romantic prospects because who wants to date someone who comes with a 7-year-old and a permanent look of exhaustion? But Monica had insisted this Troy guy was different, said he was kind and stable and had his life together, and Paige had thought, what the hell? Maybe it's time to try. Except now her babysitter was puking, and she was about to walk into a first date with her kid as a +1. She turned around in her seat. Okay, Chloe, here's the deal. Mommy is supposed to meet a friend for dinner, but Grandma got sick, so you're coming with me? I need you to be on your best behavior, okay? No complaining about the food, no iPad at the table, just good manners. And Chloe nodded seriously because she was a good kid who understood when her mom needed her to step up. Paige grabbed her purse in Chloe's hand and walked into the restaurant feeling like she was headed to her own execution. And the hostess directed them to a table near the back where a guy was already sitting, looking at his phone. He looked up when they approached, and Paige's first thought was that Monica hadn't lied about him being good-looking, dark hair, nice smile, broad shoulders, but her second thought was that he was about to witness her most embarrassing moment ever. Troy? Hi, I'm Paige, and I'm so sorry, but I brought my daughter. I hope that's okay. My babysitter fell through last minute, and I didn't want to cancel, Paige said in one rushed breath while Chloe half hid behind her leg, and she watched Troy's face go through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. He got this weird look on his face, glanced toward the entrance of the restaurant, and Paige felt her stomach drop because she knew that look. That was the look of a man calculating his exit strategy, and she was already trying to figure out how to explain to Chloe that they were leaving when Troy did something completely unexpected. He stood up and looked toward the arcade area near the front of the restaurant and called out, "Lucas, come here, buddy." And Paige watched in complete confusion as a kid who looked about 8 came running over from the arcade machines. "This is my son Lucas," Troy said, and he looked just as nervous as Paige felt. "My ex-wife was supposed to have him this weekend, but she changed her mind about 2 hours ago, said something came up, and I almost texted to reschedule, but I figured I'd just, I don't know, bring him and hope you weren't the type to freak out about kids on a first date." Paige just stared at him for a solid 5 seconds while her brain tried to process what was happening, and then she started laughing. Like actual, real laughter that made Chloe look up at her confused. "Wait, you brought your kid too? We both showed up to a blind date with our children?" And Troy was grinning now. "I guess Monica left out some pretty important details when she set this up. Probably thought if we knew we'd both bail." They sat down and the whole dynamic shifted immediately. This wasn't a romantic first date anymore. It was just 4 people having dinner, and somehow that made everything so much easier. Lucas and Chloe were shy with each other for about 30 seconds before Lucas asked if she wanted to see the arcade, and Paige said they could go play for a few minutes, and suddenly it was just her and Troy at the table looking at each other with this shared understanding of how absurd the situation was. So Monica didn't mention you had a kid, Troy said while looking at the menu, and Paige shook her head. She conveniently left that out, probably because she knew I'd use it as an excuse not to come. What about you? Troy laughed. Same. She told me you worked in medical billing and seemed adventurous, which I'm now guessing might be a lie too. And Paige admitted she hadn't done anything adventurous since Chloe was born. The kids came back and they ordered food, and the conversation flowed in this easy, natural way that Paige hadn't experienced in years. Mostly because they were talking about real stuff instead of the usual first date surface nonsense. Troy told her about how his ex-wife had left 3 years ago. Said being a mom wasn't what she thought it would be, and she needed to find herself. And now she lived across town with her new boyfriend and took Lucas every other weekend when it was convenient. Paige shared about Chloe's dad disappearing to Colorado and how she'd basically been solo parenting since Chloe was in diapers. And Troy nodded like he understood completely because he actually did. They swapped stories about terrible parent-teacher conferences and the nightmare of finding childcare, and how nobody tells you that being a single parent means you're basically always exhausted and always feeling like you're failing at everything. Lucas and Chloe were getting along surprisingly well. Chloe was naturally shy, but Lucas was one of those friendly kids who could talk to anyone, and he was showing her something on his phone that was making her giggle. They're cute together, Paige said, and Troy smiled watching them. Lucas doesn't have many friends. My ex moves him around a lot between her place and mine, and it's hard for him to make connections. It's nice seeing him just be a normal kid for once. Paige felt that in her chest because Chloe struggled with the same thing, never knowing when her dad would actually show up for his scheduled visits, always being the kid whose parent was missing from school events. This is probably the weirdest first date I've ever been on, Paige said, and Troy laughed. Same, but also maybe the best. I don't have to pretend I have my life together. You already see the chaos. They stayed at the restaurant for almost 2 hours, way longer than Paige had planned. And when they finally left, Lucas asked if they could hang out again, and Chloe was nodding enthusiastically. Troy and Paige exchanged numbers in the parking lot while the kids played tag around the cars, and Troy said, "So I know this wasn't exactly a romantic evening, but I had a really good time. Would you want to do this again? Maybe intentionally with the kids this time?" Paige felt something warm spread through her chest. Yeah, I'd really like that. It's nice talking to someone who actually gets it, you know? Most people don't understand what it's like doing this alone. Paige drove home with Chloe, chattering in the back seat about Lucas and how he was funny and nice. And Paige realized she was smiling, like genuinely smiling, for the first time in months. She'd walked into that restaurant expecting disaster and walked out with something that felt like possibility. Someone who understood her life wasn't just her, it was her and Chloe as a package deal. And he hadn't run away. He'd literally brought his own kid to the same date. She texted Monica when she got home. "You're sneaky leaving out the kid detail, but also thank you. Tonight was actually amazing." And Monica responded with about 15 celebration emojis, and "I knew you'd click. Sorry I hid the kid thing. I knew you'd both bail if I told you." Paige fell asleep that night, thinking maybe Monica was right. Maybe finding someone who was in the same boat made all the difference. Maybe this was exactly what she'd been missing all along. 6 weeks after their accidental double kid blind date, Paige and Troy had fallen into a routine that felt less like dating and more like merging two separate lives into one chaotic but surprisingly functional unit. And Paige kept telling herself this was exactly what she'd always wanted, even though some small persistent voice in the back of her head kept asking if maybe they were moving way too fast for all the wrong reasons. They saw each other at least 4 times a week, sometimes 5 or 6 if you counted the random weeknight dinners that turned into impromptu sleepovers. And every single hangout included the kids because asking their moms constantly felt like too much, and it just felt natural having Lucas and Chloe together, since they'd become completely inseparable within the first 2 weeks of knowing each other. Their routine had solidified into this predictable pattern that Paige found simultaneously comforting and slightly suffocating. Friday nights were movie nights at Troy's apartment, where the kids would build blanket forts and fall asleep on the floor, while Troy and Paige half-watched whatever animated movie was playing, and talked about work drama and childcare logistics. Saturdays, they'd take the kids to the park, or the Tulsa Zoo, or that trampoline place Lucas loved. And Paige would watch Troy interact with both kids and think about how her ex had never been this present or engaged. And that comparison made her feel grateful instead of making her examine whether gratitude was the same thing as love. Sundays had become their grocery shopping and meal prep day. They'd meet at the big Walmart on the south side and split up to tackle both their shopping lists at once. And Paige couldn't remember the last time adulting had felt this manageable, because suddenly she had a partner who showed up and helped instead of making everything harder. Troy was everything Paige's ex hadn't been, and she kept using that as proof that this relationship was good. He showed up when he said he would. He didn't complain about kid stuff derailing plans because kid stuff was the plan. He split costs fairly without making her feel bad about money, and he seemed genuinely happy to be building this weird little makeshift family situation they had going. 3 weeks into whatever they were doing, Troy had suggested the kids have a sleepover at his place, just to see how it went. And it had gone so well that now every other weekend was a full family weekend, with all four of them staying at whoever's apartment was cleaner or had less laundry piled up. Paige's best friend Monica kept texting her, asking how things were going and saying she'd known they'd be perfect together. And Paige would respond with updates about their latest family outing, and Monica would send heart emojis and say she was a matchmaking genius. But then Monica ran into Paige at Target on a Saturday morning in mid-December, and the conversation took a turn that made Paige deeply uncomfortable in a way she couldn't immediately shake off. They were standing in the home goods aisle, and Monica had that look on her face that meant she was about to say something Paige wouldn't want to hear. And sure enough, she started with, "Can I ask you something and you promise not to get all defensive and weird about it?" Paige immediately felt her shoulders tense because nothing good had ever followed that particular phrasing. "Yeah, sure, what's up?" And Monica took a breath like she was preparing for impact. "Do you actually know Troy? Like really know him beyond the surface level? Single dad who doesn't flake and shows up on time?" Monica's voice was gentle, but the question hit like she'd thrown cold water in Paige's face, and Paige tried to brush it off with a laugh that came out too forced. "Of course I know him, Monica. We spend like half our lives together at this point. What kind of question is that?" But Monica wasn't backing down, and her expression was serious in a way that made Paige's stomach twist. "Okay, so what's his favorite movie? What does he want to do with his life in 5 years besides drive a bus and raise Lucas? What are his politics, his values, the deep stuff that actually matters when you're talking about building a life with someone?" Paige opened her mouth to answer, and the words died in her throat because she genuinely had no idea. They'd never talked about any of that stuff. Their entire relationship was coordinating pickup schedules and discussing what the kids should eat for dinner, and swapping stories about terrible parenting moments and laughing about Lucas and Chloe's latest antics. "We've only been together 6 weeks, Monica. I don't need to know his entire philosophical worldview yet. We're still getting to know each other," Paige said. But even she could hear how defensive she sounded, and Monica's expression got softer, which somehow made it worse. "Babe, I'm not trying to rain on your parade. I'm genuinely happy you found someone, but I set you two up hoping you'd connect as people, not just as single parents looking for someone who understands the struggle. Make sure you're falling for him and not just falling for the idea of not having to do this alone anymore. There's a big difference." That conversation planted itself in Paige's brain and grew roots over the next week, and she started paying attention to their interactions in a way she hadn't before, really listening to what they talked about and noticing what they didn't. She realized with growing discomfort that she and Troy never discussed anything that wasn't directly related to the kids or basic life logistics. They'd never talked about their actual hopes or dreams or fears beyond the immediate worry of being good enough parents. And the few times she'd tried to steer conversation toward deeper topics, Troy would redirect back to something kid-related or tell a funny story about a passenger on his bus route. Paige decided they needed to go on an actual date, just the two of them. No children as emotional buffers or conversation facilitators. And when she brought it up to Troy during a random Wednesday phone call, he sounded genuinely confused by the suggestion. "Why, though? Everything's working really well the way we are. The kids love hanging out together. We're figuring out this co-parenting partnership thing. What's the point of complicating it?" and Paige had to actively stop herself from getting frustrated. Troy were supposed to be dating each other, not just efficiently co-parenting our kids in the same space. I want to spend time with you alone and actually talk about us instead of just talking about Lucas and Chloe. He agreed, but she could hear the reluctance in his voice, and they scheduled dinner for the following Wednesday at a nice Italian place downtown. And Paige spent the next few days feeling nervous in a way that seemed backward for someone who'd been seeing this person for over a month. Wednesday night arrived and they met at Tavola, this upscale Italian restaurant that Paige had been wanting to try, and they were both dressed up for the first time since that initial blind date. And Paige had been looking forward to this all week, thinking it would feel romantic and special, and like they were finally having a real grown-up relationship moment. Instead, it felt stiff and awkward from the moment they sat down. They made stilted small talk about the menu and the weather and work, and Paige kept catching Troy checking his phone, even though both their moms were watching the kids and everything was completely fine. She tried to start a real conversation by asking about his job. Do you actually like driving the bus, or is it just something you do for the benefits? And Troy shrugged. It's fine. Pays the bills. Has good insurance. Not much more to it than that. Paige pushed further because that answer felt like a dodge. But what do you want to do? Like if money and time weren't factors, what would you be doing with your life? And Troy looked uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, took a long drink of water before answering. I try not to think about stuff like that anymore. I've got Lucas and responsibilities. What I want doesn't really factor into it. She told him about her medical billing work and watched his eyes glaze over after about 30 seconds when she tried to explain why she found the insurance coding system fascinating, and they both ended up pivoting back to talking about their kids because that was the only conversational territory that felt safe and natural. Halfway through their entrees, Paige suggested they should take a trip somewhere in the spring, maybe visit Branson or drive down to see the Ozarks with the kids, and Troy made this face like she'd suggested something unreasonable. I don't really do planning that far ahead. I'm more of a see how I feel when the time comes kind of person. I like keeping my options open and staying flexible. Paige felt something cold settle in her stomach because she was the complete opposite of that. She lived and died by her Google Calendar, had color-coded spreadsheets for her monthly budget, needed structure and planning to feel like she had any control over her chaotic life. And the idea of just winging major decisions made her genuinely anxious. They kept talking and more fundamental differences emerged with every passing minute. Paige mentioned an article she'd read about climate change, and Troy said he honestly hadn't thought much about it either way. She asked if he followed politics, and he shrugged, saying, not really, he was really into college football. And Paige found sports mind-numbingly boring. She talked about wanting to eventually buy a house and build equity. And he said he was perfectly content renting for the rest of his life because he didn't want to be tied down to one place. By the time the waiter brought dessert menus, Paige was having a low-grade panic attack because they had absolutely nothing in common beyond being single parents to kids who happened to like each other. And the foundation of their entire relationship was convenience and shared circumstance rather than actual compatibility. The drive home was quiet in that tense way, where both people know something's wrong, but neither wants to be the first to say it out loud. And when Troy dropped her off at her apartment, he said, that was nice. We should definitely do it again sometime. But his voice had this hollow quality that suggested he felt the same disconnect she did. Paige went inside and sat on her couch in the dark, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. And the truth was becoming painfully and unavoidably obvious. She and Troy had built their entire relationship on relief. Relief at finding someone who understood the single-parent struggle, relief at not being lonely anymore, relief at having help with the constant, grinding work of raising kids alone. But relief wasn't the same as love, and understanding someone's circumstances wasn't the same as actually knowing them as a person. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting, that one awkward dinner didn't negate 6 weeks of functional partnership, but she couldn't unsee what that evening had revealed. They were basically roommates who occasionally kissed and coordinated their kids' social calendars. They functioned well as a tag team parenting unit, but there was zero depth to their romantic relationship. No real intimacy beyond the surface-level comfort of shared experience. The worst part was she genuinely liked Troy as a person. He was kind and reliable and good with both kids. But liking someone and being compatible with them long term were two completely different things. And Paige was starting to suspect they'd mistaken practical partnership for romantic connection. She lay awake that night staring at her ceiling and trying to figure out how she'd gotten here, how she'd gone from one chaotic blind date with kids in tow to a relationship that felt inevitable but fundamentally wrong. And she didn't have good answers, just this growing certainty that something had to change before they made an even bigger mess of an already complicated situation, especially with Chloe and Lucas now completely bonded and talking about being siblings someday. Paige's breaking point came on a random Tuesday evening when her mom came over to watch Chloe and found Paige crying at the kitchen table surrounded by bills and her laptop open to a half-written breakup text to Troy. And her mom sat down across from her with that look that meant she was about to drop some hard truth, whether Paige wanted to hear it or not. "You're thinking about ending things with Troy, aren't you?" her mom said, and it wasn't even a question. And Paige wiped her face, feeling like a complete failure at yet another thing in her life. "I don't know what I'm doing, Mom. I thought finding another single parent would solve everything. But we have nothing in common. We barely know each other beyond kid logistics, and now Chloe and Lucas are best friends, so if I break up with him, I'm destroying her friendship too. I've completely messed this up." Her mom reached across the table and took her hand. "Honey, I've held back, but you can't build a life on shared struggle. That's not love. That's just two people surviving together. And you deserve more than that. Chloe deserves to see you in a relationship built on actual connection, not just convenience." Those words hit Paige like cold water, and she realized her mom was right. She'd spent 2 months convincing herself that compatibility meant understanding each other's schedules, when really they'd just been using each other as emotional support animals to avoid dealing with their own loneliness. She texted Troy that night asking if they could talk, just the two of them. And when he showed up at her apartment the next evening, without Lucas, she could tell by his face that he knew this conversation was coming. They sat on her couch with way too much space between them, and Paige tried to figure out how to say what needed saying without sounding like a jerk. "Troy, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be really honest. Are we together because we actually love each other, or because it's easier than being alone?" She watched him process the question and saw something flicker across his face that looked like relief mixed with fear. And when he answered, his voice was quiet. "I don't know, Paige. I thought I knew. But that dinner we had, the one without the kids, I realized I don't actually know what we are, beyond two people who make good co-parents. And that's been freaking me out for weeks, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding like I was ending things." Paige felt tears starting, but pushed through. "I think we rushed this. We were both so relieved to find someone who understood the single parent thing that we skipped all the actual getting to know each other parts. And now we're in this relationship that looks like it should work, but doesn't actually feel right." Troy nodded and rubbed his face. "So what do we do? Break up? Because the kids are going to be devastated. Lucas has started asking when we're all going to move in, and I don't know how to tell him that's not happening." They sat in heavy silence for a minute before Paige said something that surprised even herself. "What if we actually try dating? Like for real this time, no kids as buffers, intentional time getting to know each other as actual people instead of just coordinating parents." Troy looked skeptical. "You want to start over?" And Paige shook her head. "Not start over, just slow down and do this right. Go on actual dates where we talk about real stuff, figure out if we're compatible beyond our shared circumstances. Because Troy, I don't want to be with someone just because it's convenient. I want to be with someone I actually choose and who chooses me back." They agreed to try it, scheduled their first real date for that Saturday, and Troy left with this expression that was half hopeful and half terrified. And Paige felt the same way because what if they did this properly and discovered they genuinely didn't work? What then? Their first intentional date was at a coffee shop on a Saturday morning. No dinner pressure, just coffee and conversation. And Paige asked Troy questions she should have asked months ago. "What do you actually want out of life? Like beyond being Lucas's dad, what are your dreams?" And Troy had to think for a long time before answering. I don't know if I've let myself dream in years. Being a bus driver wasn't the plan. It was just what I could get with decent benefits after the divorce. But if I'm being honest, I've always wanted to do something in the transit management, like actually help design better public transportation systems. I just never thought it was realistic with a kid and everything. Paige felt herself actually seeing him for the first time. Why isn't it realistic? There are programs for that. You could go back to school part-time. Troy looked at her like she'd suggested something impossible. And who's going to watch Lucas while I'm in class? His mom's unreliable, and I can't afford childcare on top of tuition. But Paige was already thinking through logistics because that's what she did. What if we actually helped each other? I watch Lucas during your class times. You watch Chloe when I need you to. We could make it work if we wanted to. The conversation shifted after that, became less about why things wouldn't work and more about possibilities. And Troy asked her what she wanted, and Paige admitted she'd been thinking about going back to school too. Wanted to become a nurse instead of doing medical billing forever, but same problem. Single parent with no support system and no time. They started meeting like this every week, Saturday morning coffee dates, where they actually talked about real things. And Paige learned that Troy was funny when he wasn't stressed about kid stuff. He did this terrible impression of his bus route regulars that made her laugh until she cried. And he loved history podcasts and terrible action movies and had this whole philosophy about how public spaces should be designed. Troy learned that Paige was way more adventurous than he'd thought. She just never had the opportunity. She wanted to go hiking and camping and see the world. But being a single mom had put all that on hold, and she had strong opinions about healthcare reform and read poetry before bed, and was terrified of failure, which was why she clung so hard to structure and planning. The more they talked, the more Paige realized something that shifted her entire perspective. Their differences weren't incompatibilities, they were complements. She needed someone to push her out of her comfort zone, and Troy needed someone to ground him when his spontaneity got too chaotic. He dreamed big and she made plans. She worried about the future, and he reminded her to be present. And somewhere, in actually getting to know each other, they were building something that felt real instead of just convenient. 3 months into dating properly, actually dating not just coexisting, Troy enrolled in a night program at Tulsa Community College for Transit Management, and Paige started taking prerequisite classes online for a nursing program. And they traded off childcare and studied together after the kids went to bed. And it was hard, but it was the good kind of hard where you're building something that matters. Paige's mom noticed the change immediately. You're different with him now. You actually light up when he texts instead of just being content. And Paige realized it was true. She'd gone from being comfortable to being genuinely excited about this relationship, about who Troy was as a person, not just as a fellow single parent. They had their first real fight 4 months in about politics of all things, and instead of avoiding it or letting it fester, they actually talked through their different viewpoints and found middle ground. And afterward, Troy had said, "This is the first relationship where I don't feel like I have to agree with everything to keep the peace." And Paige had felt the same way, like she could be fully herself and disagree, and it wouldn't end everything. 6 months after their "let's actually date" conversation, they were back at the harvest table, the same restaurant where they'd had that disastrous first date with both kids in tow. Except this time, it was intentional. All four of them together for Lucas's 9th birthday dinner. The kids were coloring on their menus, and Paige and Troy were actually talking. Not about schedules or logistics, but about a podcast Troy had listened to and Paige's opinion on it. And Lucas looked up and said, "Dad, you're smiling different. Like real smiling, not tired smiling." And Troy reached under the table for Paige's hand. "You know what's wild?" Troy said while watching the kids draw. "If someone had told me 8 months ago that bringing my kid to a blind date would lead to this, I would have thought they were crazy. I thought we were just two desperate single parents settling for each other because we were tired of being alone." Paige squeezed his hand. "And now?" And Troy looked at her with this expression that made her heart do something complicated. "Now I know the difference between settling and choosing. I'm choosing you, Paige, not because you understand my life or make co-parenting easier. I'm choosing you because you make me want to be better than I was. Because you challenge me and support me, and you're the person I want to talk to about everything. and that has nothing to do with the kids. Paige felt tears starting, the good kind this time. I was so scared we were just together because of shared trauma or whatever. But Troy, you've shown me what partnership actually looks like. Not someone who completes me, but someone who complements me, who pushes me to grow while loving exactly who I am right now. Chloe interrupted, asking if they could get dessert, completely oblivious to the emotional moment happening across the table. And Troy laughed. Yeah, Bug, we can get dessert. We're celebrating. And Lucas asked, celebrating what? And Troy looked at Paige for permission before saying, celebrating that sometimes the messiest starts lead to the best endings. Sometimes finding someone who shares your struggles is just the beginning. And the real relationship starts when you stop surviving together and start actually living. When you move past the relief of not being alone and into the choice of building something real. When you learn that compatibility isn't about having everything in common, it's about how your differences make you both better. Paige had walked into that first date thinking she'd found someone who understood her life, and she had. But more importantly, she'd found someone willing to do the hard work of actually knowing her. And that made all the difference between settling and choosing, between convenient and committed, between good enough and actually good. If this story reminded you that love built on shared struggle is just the foundation and you still have to build the actual house, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you believe slowing down can save a relationship that started too fast. We love hearing your stories. Thanks for being here with us, and remember that bringing your kid to a blind date might be unthinkable, but sometimes the unthinkable moments lead to the most real love. You just have to be brave enough to do the work of actually getting to know each other beyond the convenient parts.